Today I will be talking about promoting extensive risk dynamics in DRR analysis and loss accounting systems. But because I haven't met a lot of you in CMCC in person, I thought I'd take this opportunity to introduce myself a little bit. So as Yaro mentioned, I'm a political ecologist and basically a development geographer by training. I did my PhD in political ecology, and I looked at how people make decisions as part of large groups in the context of risk and environmental conflict. More specifically, I focused on in a landless peasant movement in Pakistan, and I looked at the role of identity, politics, and individual interest in collective decision making. After that, I worked at King's College in London. I did a postdoctoral fellowship over there, where I looked at institutional risk management and the effectiveness of disaster risk reduction policies, both in the context of Europe and internationally. And most recently, I was based at UCL at the Institute of Risk and Disaster Reduction, where I was working as an adjunct lecturer, but also as a research fellow, again, looking at the themes of adaptive governance, risk perception, and risk management. So currently, I'm here at CMCC working on the SMALLDIS project, which is funded by the Marie Curie Research Fellowship. And my project basically looks at the impact of small-scale disaster events. I'm interested in exploring how we conceptually understand small-scale disasters, how we manage and measure them, and then if they result in any behavior change or learning at the institutional or community level. So very briefly, my project is divided in roughly into two parts, and I'll be talking more about the first part today. So initially, I've conducted a conceptual assessment of the tools and mechanisms we have for capturing data on extensive risk and on small-scale disasters, and how our conceptualization and definition of this aspect of disaster risk shapes how we measure it. The second part of my project will be more empirically focused, where I'll actually look at case studies or social aspects of risk, and how the incidence of small-scale events triggers changes in risk perception, disaster management, and learning at both the institutional and community levels. So in order to study the impact of small-scale disasters, I had to first go back and look at how we, in general, understand and measure the impacts of disasters in general. So recently there's been a big push towards improving loss recording systems for disasters, and this is partly because of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction and the Sustainable Development Goals, which have quite a few indicators in common. And so there's a move towards improving these databases and loss recording methodologies, but I think most of the time we look at infographics like the one on the screen, and even as academics or disaster practitioners, we think, okay, well, we know quite a bit about the impacts of disasters in general. But if we actually think about where this data is coming from, there's quite a few inconsistencies and gaps in the data. And it's just as a quick example, I've put two figures that I found on the European Union website. One is from the European Environment Agency, and the other is from the European Commission, or the DG ECHO website, to be more specific. And one of them says, they refer to different time periods, but one of them estimates that in the EU we lost around 445 billion euros in economic losses between 1980 and 2011, and the second figure says 100 billion between 2002 and 2014. Now, I'm not very good at maths, but if you try to deduct the annual average losses that are being expressed in both figures, you'll find that there's actually quite a bit of a difference. So in the first figure, I think it comes up to around 14, 15 billion euros per year in losses, and the second one is around 8 billion euros in losses. And the second one is more recent, so you would actually think that would be a little bit higher. And it's not a big inconsistency, but it's still an interesting one because it it shows us that even within the same organization, you have two different wings or departments that are giving you different numbers. And in order to understand why there's such a lot of discrepancy in the data, it's very important to look at the sources for data that are used by such organizations. Basically, any information that comes out of, most of the information that comes out of the World Bank, the European Union, international governments, national governments, international organizations, rely on data from a limited number of global databases that have coverage in terms of measuring losses from disaster databases. I've listed 4 at the top because these are the larger ones. In addition to these, there are some national databases that exist that are maintained by individual countries, like SMALLDIS for the US. And then there are hazard-specific databases that exist for particular hazards, like for floods, for forest fires, etc. But again, they're limited in coverage. But the two main databases that are used to provide information behind all these figures that you see at an international level that support policy making and decision making, both globally and nationally, come basically from EMDAT, which is developed and maintained by the Center for Research on Emergencies and Disasters at the University of Louvain in Belgium, and Munich Re, or NatCat, which is maintained by Munich Re. It's also important to notice that EMDAT is public and so is the Centro, but the other 2 databases that are maintained by reinsurance companies are actually private, and this information, most of the data you have to pay for to access. So taking information again from the 2 main sources, if you look at what EMDAT and NatCat say about globally reported losses from 2001 to 2011, again, you'll notice that there's a fair degree of difference in reporting. EMDAT says it was 1.25 trillion US dollars, whereas NatCat says 1.68 trillion dollars. And it's interesting because NatCat actually is mostly operational in countries with a lot of insurance, with a reasonable or high level of insurance penetration. It mostly considers losses reported in terms of insurance losses or national losses, national level losses, whereas EMDAT aims to capture losses for all countries. And so again, it's interesting to see that the database that's supposed to have greater coverage is actually reporting a lower level of loss. And we can see this for countries that have maintained or have developed national databases. In the figure on the right, the EMDAT, the amount of losses reported in EMDAT is reported in gray, and the additional losses from national data sets is reported in orange. And so you can see that EMDAT is actually underreporting, or in the case of Jordan or Uganda, not reporting, or reporting very few disaster events. And it's also important to point out that none of these databases provide information on, well, direct information on social, environmental, or intangible losses such as cultural losses, etc. And they have very little to no information on indirect costs, wider impacts, and long-term macroeconomic effects of disasters. So one of the reasons that disasters get included or not included in these databases, and one of the reasons for this inconsistency is because each database has established formal inclusion thresholds to provide some degree of consistency and some degree of coherence to the data. And if you look at the inclusion threshold for EMDAT, they only register or consider disasters that result in more than 10 dead people, or 100 or more affected, and a declaration of state emergency or call for international assistance. Now, this is actually a fairly high threshold in terms of recording and registering disasters, and I would argue that this is successful in capturing the extreme events, but not necessarily in more localized or smaller scale events. NatCat, on the other hand, has 6 levels of catastrophe for registering information in its database. And the lowest level is level 1, which is for small-scale loss event, which corresponds to events that result in 1 to 9 fatalities or small-scale damage. But the thing to remember here, so this inclusion threshold appears to be a little more lightweight than that for MDAT. But the thing to remember here that each of these databases have a fixed number of data categories that are represented in terms of the information that they provide about disasters. And NatCat only gives you information about the number of fatalities and the amount of economic loss as a result of damage. So you can't really take this data to understand anything about people that have been affected in different ways that doesn't revolve around direct damage or fatalities. And a classic case for this is droughts, where you don't have a lot of direct impacts, direct physical impacts, but it's still considered a disaster. Of course, some of those events would not be included then in NatCat, depending on whether they were insured or not, etc. And certainly, social impacts, environmental impacts would not be reflected in these two databases in that sense. Sigma has an even higher threshold for inclusion. And the fourth database that I'll be talking about a lot more later is this Inventar. This is a national level database, but the structure is promoted by the UN, the UNISDR and UNDP in particular. And this Inventar is at the opposite end of the spectrum because they include all events caused by natural hazards that might have resulted in any sort of impact. Now, this Inventar has a lot of advantages. It's the only database that provides information that's disaggregated at the local scale. With MDAT and NatCat, you only get information at the national level. So it's impossible to disaggregate them to try and understand anything about losses at a regional or local level. This Inventar also considers a much wider range of sectors affected by different disasters. So you have information on agriculture, transport, etc. But the problem with this Inventar is that in terms of the methodology, their source for data comes from formal sources like national governments, international organizations, humanitarian organizations, but they also draw most of their information from media and newspapers. And so that sort of causes a lot of problems in terms of data validity and data consistency. And there's no lower bound of inclusion in this Inventar. So in general, we can see that there's lots of problems and gaps in the kind of coverage that is provided by these databases, which then in turn support most of the data that we have on the impact of disasters at a global and also at a national level. Now this data becomes important and interesting when we try and connect it with our conceptual understandings of disaster risk and the kinds of disasters that exist. And I've provided this scheme that I think is fairly useful in kind of linking or placing disaster risk within overall risk and vulnerability drivers. But in disaster risk studies, we basically consider two forms of risk, or two risk layers that compose overall risk. And one is intensive risk, and the other is extensive risk. Now, intensive risk is risk associated with high severity, mid to low frequency events, mainly associated with major hazards. And so here we're talking about your Indian Ocean tsunami, your major earthquakes, large-scale flooding, etc. And then extensive risk hazards are associated with what we call small-scale disasters, which have also been called everyday disasters, quotidian disasters, everyday events. And extensive risk is associated with low-severity, high-frequency events, which are mainly but not exclusively associated with highly localized hazards. And the differentiation is important because not only do these kinds of risks produce different sorts of disasters. They're important in understanding the underlying risk drivers behind the various forms of disaster impacts. So intensive risk events mainly focus on areas with high concentration of population, high concentration of productive assets, and of exposed assets, whereas extensive risk focuses on more localized risk that's probably less driven by exposure of assets or by the intensity of the hazard, and instead is more determined by underlying risk drivers such as poor local and urban governance, vulnerable rural livelihoods in particular, but vulnerable livelihoods, ecosystem decline, and lack of access to risk transfer and local protection. If you look at the disaster risk literature, but even at the literature in climate change adaptation, and to some extent even in literature on natural hazards, most of the focus is on extreme risks and extreme events, and very little has actually been written about extensive risk or small-scale hazards. One of the there's been some academic studies that have been conducted on the issue, but the most amount of work that's been done on the topic has been done by the Global Assessment Report of the UNISDR, which is a series of reports looking at the development of disaster risk over time, disaster risk management over time. And here are some of the things that we know about small-scale hazards and why they're important. First of all, small-scale recurrent hazards are usually of a low severity, and they're driven by poverty, inequality, weak governance, lack of access to risk transfer, like I mentioned. They're mainly, but not limited to, hazards like flash floods, landslides, urban flooding, storms, hazards that have mostly a local focus rather than a national or regional impact scale. They have a greater impact in low and middle income countries, and this is generally because these countries have lower levels of protective infrastructure, environmental management, etc. And again, so you can see the theme developing here, how this is very close, these kinds of disasters are very closely tied to development structures and the level of preparedness within the system. Small-scale hazards generally don't contribute very much to the amount of mortality or direct physical impact that results from disasters, but have a significant economic, social, and environmental cost. And this is important again because it's not necessarily captured in most of the databases that we've been talking about. They result in negative welfare outcomes because they might be of a smaller scale, but the higher frequency means that they erode away at local development structures. And this includes health, productivity, nutrition, and increases in inequality and unemployment. And unlike extreme events, the costs of small-scale hazards are not usually absorbed by insurance, by international assistance, or governments, as is the case with extreme risk events, because these are generally issues for local governments or regional governments to deal with. And in the long run, small-scale hazards have the potential of eroding overall resilience of communities and undermining the potential for future development. So the Global Assessment Report of the GAR took data from this inventory, which actually includes small and small-scale disasters. And at that time, this inventory was operational in 56 countries. Now it's operational in over 80, almost 90 countries in the world. And they separated extensive risk hazards from intensive risk hazards, or extreme events from small-scale events. And it's very clear to see that you have, in the period between 1981 and 2011, so in that 30-year bracket, in 56 countries, you have 1,877 reported incidents of extreme risk, but you have 243,000 small or medium scale events taking place at the, during the same time. These events are only responsible for 13% of overall mortality caused after disasters. It's much higher in the case of intensive risk events. But in terms of overall economic losses, the GAR found that frequent smaller scale events, just because of the number of events more than anything else, were responsible for about 42% of overall losses that take place after disasters, in relation to 58% of losses caused after extreme events. So even though this is a fairly understudied and under-examined area of disaster risk, we can see that in terms of impact, smaller scale events are actually responsible for a lot of costs that are then taken on by mostly local governments and absorbed by local structures for risk management. The second infographic is just highlighting how extensive risk hazards might not impact physical damage directly in terms of infrastructure or morbidity, mortality, but they do have a very high impact on infrastructure processes, on social processes, etc., on business disruption. So in terms of interruptions to water supply, interruptions to power supply, damaged roads, and interruptions to communications, extensive risk events or small-scale events actually accounted for the majority of losses in these particular sectors. And again, to highlight, these are sectors that are not covered, necessarily covered by most disaster databases. Not an economist, so I'm going to try and explain this graph, but if I get it wrong, excuse me. I'm sure some of you know more about this than I do. This is basically a loss accidents curve, in this case for Honduras. It was constructed or put together by the CMCC Foundation in Barcelona, and what they did was they took empirical data on historical losses caused by small-scale disasters, which you see is the top part of this curve. They then combined it with probabilistic loss assessments from extreme events in the future, and they joined up the two to come up with a hybrid loss accidents curve. And this basically reflects the amount of losses that take place in terms of the different types of disasters and the different return periods for hazard events. So of course, and I always find it easier to look at this if you invert the chart and flip it over, the higher the greater the return period, the more extreme the event, the higher the amount of losses. But this is to demonstrate that anything even from 10-year return period, so anything occurring regularly over 10 years, still incurs losses of up to hundreds of millions. And sorry, so yeah, so if you invert it, it's easier, and this whole area would be losses from sort of smaller scale events, and this would be from extreme. So this is not to juxtapose the two kinds of events together and say, well, one causes more potential losses than the other, but just to highlight the fact that small scale events also result in a fair amount of damages and losses. So for my work, in order to study small scale disasters and their impact, I first needed to actually, in some way or the other, define boundaries for what constitutes a small-scale disaster. We intuitively kind of know what is an extreme event. And it's an extreme disaster, something extreme has happened, but it's much harder to do that with small-scale disasters. And to some degree, this is true for all disasters, I think, because it's not so easy to create parameters or thresholds like the one created by MDAT or other academic studies that say, well, anything between 1 to 9 or anything less than 10 or less than 20 is a small scale event. Because a lot of these values are actually relative to the context of where and when and how a disaster takes place. One of a really interesting example for me always is, one can argue the upper bound of small-scale disasters is easy to establish. Anything that's not an extreme event is then automatically a small-scale event. So even if we use definitions like MDAT and say, well, anything less than 10 is then automatically a small-scale disaster, we can kind of come to some degree of consensus about what is not extreme, hence we know what is small. But it's also important to know, well, what is the lower end of small-scale disasters? And an organization called the Global Network for Disaster Risk Reduction, it's a civil society conglomerate of NGOs from around the world that are involved in disaster risk, ran a campaign last year. It was called the 365 days of disasters. And they wanted to highlight the amount of small-scale hazards that happened every day around the world that were not being captured in databases or being given enough attention to in policy and larger circles. So they asked all their member organizations to tweet in every time there was an event, a local disaster that took place. Now, as a result, they got a huge amount of response, and a lot of people responded almost every day, tweeting in examples of flash floods, landslides, etc., small-scale events that were taking place in their communities or their cities. But they soon had a problem, because then people started writing in and saying, well, there was a road accident and 3 people died, and that's a disaster that happened in my community. Or someone drowned in the local pond after a lot of rainfall, that's a disaster. And so when they tried to put together all of these events, they, again, it's kind of intuitive. A road accident is not necessarily the kind of disasters that we're talking about when we're talking about disaster loss databases. And so it's important to distinguish small-scale disasters then from accidents and emergencies as well, because there's a danger of including everything in the results, which is one of the criticisms of the Discussant database, that it has no lower level bounds as well. So I tasked myself with the wonderful job of trying to make some sense of how we could put some boundaries around small-scale disasters. And I very quickly realized that it was sort of a very relative and rolling scale, and we can understand small-scale disasters obviously by risk in terms of intensive or extensive risk, but also by impact. If you look at impact in terms of physical impact, what is a big disaster might not necessarily be, or what is a small disaster might not be a small disaster for another hazard, or if you measure by another impact. So if we look at droughts, for example, they might not result in a lot of deaths, they might not result in damages to houses or buildings necessarily, but agriculturally, in the agricultural sector, it might be a big disaster. Or a small disaster, but not registered at all as a disaster if we're considering different sort of impacts. For example, in MDAT, the only categories that are included in a data event are number of deaths, number of people affected, number of houses destroyed, and number of houses damaged, and overall economic losses, and that's it. So again, and what's small and large, or what is a disaster or not a disaster, is also very affected by time scale and how we actually measure disasters. So again, coming back to slow onset disasters like droughts and heat waves, if we're deciding a disaster is a disaster based on the impact it has, in terms of the number of deaths it has, well, when do you start counting the deaths? So if a drought starts, do we start counting a drought from the day that there's a meteorological drought, sorry, I can never say that word right, meteorological drought, or do we start counting the impact of the drought from the day that it starts manifesting any kind of impact, or from the first day that someone dies from this drought? Again, when do we stop counting the impacts for this drought? Is it when the physiological end meteorological end has finished? Because a lot of the times in these kinds of disasters, the impacts manifest over a much longer period of time than the event itself. So depending on when you're measuring and how you're measuring can change the impacts that you come up with, which then again affects whether you classify disaster as small or large. The spatial change in context also completely changes what can be considered small or big disaster. In the classic example of this is the difference between urban and rural disasters. So perhaps 10 people dying in flash floods, or well, in flooding, localized flooding in Beijing in China might not be considered an extreme event, but the same event taking place in a smaller community or in a local setting, or I mean a rural setting, might actually be considered a fairly disastrous event. Again, also because of the knock-on effects of the direct or the first degree impacts of the hazard event. The level of development and protection also affects whether we can consider an event to be small or large or a disaster at all. The same hazard can manifest in a developed country. So you can have extreme rainfall in Italy, for example, and because there's a higher degree of development and protection, investment in protection measures, it might not actually result in a huge level of losses, whereas the same hazard in another context might result in larger amounts of losses. And the third issue, again, is always a question of risk perception. My favorite example of this is in Karachi, which is a city in Pakistan. It's the largest city in Pakistan of around 24 million people. And because of rapid urban growth and bad planning, up to around 15 years ago, we started experiencing local flooding annually during the monsoon season in the city. And the first time it happened, it was considered to be a fairly disastrous event. It resulted in huge business disruption and disruption of transport. It resulted in deaths from people getting electrocuted and falling down manholes. But over time, this event started happening on a yearly basis, on a seasonal basis, sometimes even more frequently. And now it's a fairly normal event, and people don't necessarily treat it as an extreme disaster event or even a disaster event. People have come up with some adaptive sort of mechanisms or behavior changes to deal with the event, and life goes on, and it's not necessarily registered in national records as even an emergency or a small-scale incident. So in order to proceed with my research, I tried to separate different categories or parameters that I could use then to make sense of existing data in databases, but also ways in which we can improve databases to separate between extreme events and small-scale events. And again, it's kind of going over some of the things I've been talking about. But we know already that extreme events result in higher mortality, physical damages, and all kinds of damages really, but compared to small-scale events, they have more of a physical impact, whereas small-scale events have more of a social, economic, and development level impact. So if we are trying to look for or trying to produce better data on small-scale events and the impact of small-scale events, we definitely need to be considering sectors that are right now underrepresented or not represented at all in disaster databases. We can also try and come up with a dividing line between extreme events and small-scale events by looking at return periods. So 1 in 100-year event is extreme, perhaps 1 in 50 as well. And we definitely know events with frequent return periods are generally of a smaller scale. So if we look at existing data and we look at it in terms of return periods, we can come up with sort of some kind of moving threshold which distinguishes between the two. And it's really important to point out that a lot of our data on disaster losses comes from insurance databases. But for insurance purposes, events that occur on a seasonal level or even a 1 in 10 years or 1 in 15 years are not necessarily insurable, and so they're not considered at all or included in insurance databases. So again, to reflect that this kind of information on these kinds of hazards is right now not well represented in the data we have. We can try and distinguish between extreme and small-scale events based on the intensity of the physical hazard itself. Again, this is problematic depending on the context where the hazard manifests, etc. But to some degree, we know that localized hazards such as landslides and storms can generally be categorized as smaller scale events, even though there have been examples of extreme impacts resulting from those kinds of hazards. Similarly, again, floods are generally extreme events, but of course there are incidents of localized seasonal flooding. So yeah, another way of separating the two is just looking at the physical scale of measurement, how we measure impact. So right now there's a tendency to measure the impact of disasters at a national level, and I think if we move to looking at impacts at a local level, that would be a lot more useful in capturing the impact of smaller scale events. I've also, in my sort of schema, I've recognized there are a lot of influencing factors that that decide whether an event can be categorized or as extreme or small, and this includes effectiveness of risk governance structures, level of investment in protection measures, adaptive capacity and resilience, and again, risk perception in dealing with these issues. So very quickly and summarizing, in terms of my overall assessment of how we can incorporate extensive risk into disaster risk analysis and measuring losses, I've come up with the conclusion that the relative nature of small-scale events means that any fixed quantitative threshold or universal quantitative threshold will essentially be arbitrary. So thresholds established by MDAT saying 1 in 9 for all hazards, for all kinds of disasters in all places, I think don't necessarily serve as a very good limitation or a distinguishing line between small-scale disasters and extreme events. Instead, I recommend that we need to capture a large amount of data, and I'm going to move to this list in not necessarily an ordered way, but we need to capture data from a different, a wider range of affected sectors, and a lot of this information actually exists. It's just not been included in disaster risk databases to a very extensive degree, such as information on agricultural losses, information on industrial production or losses in production, etc. We need to definitely try and collect data which can be disaggregated to the lowest administrative scale of governance. I know some people argue it's already hard enough for national governments to collect this data at a national level, but I think especially with the introduction of Sendai, etc., there's a huge move and initiative by national governments to come up with new structures of data collection in terms of meeting the requirements for the Sendai indicators. And a lot of this information does exist at the local government. It might just be with local civil protection or other organizations that haven't necessarily been involved in the construction and maintenance of international databases. We definitely, if we do have thresholds, we need to be specific in terms of the different hazards that we're talking about. We can't just have one threshold for all kinds of hazards. And any information on, well, small and large scale disasters, but particularly small scale disasters, should have metadata and inclusion criteria of the source of that data and what was included. It needs to include information on return periods, frequency, the duration of events, and intensity of events, because this is important for all disasters, but it's particularly important for distinguishing between extreme events and small-scale events. There also needs to be some consideration anyway of event chains and cascading impacts, and this is more important for small-scale events because smaller-scale events don't necessarily have a lot of direct impacts. They have a lot of indirect impacts and secondary impacts. So, and I can talk about it later, but yeah, anyway, need that information, and we need to express information as relative impacts. So it's not just enough to give economic losses, but economic losses must, I would recommend that they're expressed as a percentage of local GDP, and also in terms of affected people as a percentage of local population. And then there needs to be more, I think, at a global level, and we're seeing this with the Sendai indicators, more guidance at a global level on loss classification and attribution. So, for example, one of the papers I'm working on right now is looking at the connection between migration and displacement and small-scale hazards or high-frequency events. And it's very hard to attribute one to the other because it's not like, or for example, heat waves, people die as a result of heat waves, but in national death registration systems, it's not listed as heat waves, it's listed as heart attacks or respiratory problems, etc. So we need to improve attribution systems. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to do this really quickly. So my conclusions overall, I've just talked about them. We need basically improved data recording. We have problems with recording small-scale events, but I think quantitative thresholds are not helpful. But we can use some of the parameters that I've provided, which are both qualitative and quantitative, to help estimate the impact of small-scale events and differentiate them from extreme events. And I think this issue is extremely important because it has a lot of implications for constructing DRR policy, for decision making, and investing in the prevention of disasters as well. And here are some of the things I am going to be working on in the future, and I'm currently working on, but I think I'm going to conclude there because I've run out of time.